The glass window on the 42nd floor reflected a man who looked nothing like the fighter he used to be. Richard Hayes stood there, his reflection merging with the city lights below, watching three men in expensive suits gather their briefcases with the kind of finality that made his chest tighten. Behind him, the boardroom was a graveyard of failed attempts. Coffee cups scattered across the table, presentation slides still glowing on the screen. Charts and numbers that had meant everything an hour ago now meant absolutely nothing. 3 weeks of negotiations, sleepless nights, revised proposals, countless strategy sessions with his team, and it was all collapsing right in front of him. The million-dollar partnership his company desperately needed was slipping through his fingers like water, and Richard Hayes, the self-made millionaire who had built an empire from nothing, stood frozen because he had run out of answers. The foreign investors had listened to every word, analyzed every number, and still sat across that polished conference table with expressions carved from stone. Every pitch he delivered fell flat. Every strategy felt hollow. The lead investor had stood up 20 minutes ago, his tone polite but cold, his words final. "We need to think about this, Mr. Hayes. We'll be in touch." That phrase, Richard knew, was corporate speak for "we're done here." The door had closed behind them, and the room fell into the kind of silence that screamed failure. His CFO had cursed under his breath. His operations director had stared blankly at her tablet. The two junior analysts looked like they wanted to vanish. Richard had told them all to take a break, his voice barely above a whisper. They left without a word, and now he stood alone in that massive room, replaying every moment of the meeting in his head, searching for what he had missed, what he hadn't said, what he could have done differently. That was when the door opened again. He didn't turn around. He assumed it was Michael coming back to debrief, or maybe Karen trying to salvage something from the wreckage. But the sound was different, quieter, the soft roll of wheels on polished floors, the gentle clink of cleaning supplies. Richard turned slightly and saw her, a woman in her late 30s pushing a cleaning cart, her navy blue uniform neat and pressed, her name stitched in white thread across her chest. Diane. She moved into the room with the kind of practiced invisibility that came from years of working in spaces where people looked through you instead of at you. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and her hands, worn but steady, reached for the trash bin near the far end of the table. She worked quietly, efficiently, the way someone does when they've done the same task 1,000 times before. Richard turned back to the window. He wasn't in the mood for small talk, and he doubted she was either, but as Diane moved around the room, emptying bins and wiping down surfaces, she couldn't help but notice the tension still hanging in the air. She had been cleaning these offices for nearly 4 years, and she had seen this scene play out before. Executives pacing, teams huddled in worried whispers, deals that lived and died in rooms like this one. But tonight felt different. The man standing at the window looked like someone drowning. She hesitated near the whiteboard, where someone had scribbled notes from the presentation. Words like market leadership and proven growth and strategic advantage were still visible in blue ink. She glanced at Richard, then back at the board. Then, almost without thinking, she spoke. Her voice was soft but clear. "Maybe they don't want to be impressed. Maybe they just want to be understood." Richard turned sharply, his eyes locking on hers. For a moment, neither of them said anything. Diane felt her heart race. She had overstepped. She knew it. This wasn't her world. She was the cleaning lady. She wasn't supposed to have opinions about boardroom deals and million-dollar partnerships, but Richard didn't look angry. He looked confused. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice quiet but curious. Diane set down the cloth she was holding and took a breath. "I'm sorry, sir. I shouldn't have said anything. It's not my place." Richard stepped closer. "No. Tell me, what do you mean they want to be understood?" She looked at him for a long moment, weighing whether to continue. Then she spoke again, her tone careful but honest. "You've been talking to them for weeks, right?" Richard nodded. "And you've shown them all the numbers, all the data, all the projections?" He nodded again. Diane's voice softened. "But did you ever tell them why?" "Why what?" Richard asked. "Why you built this company, why it matters to you, why they should trust you, and not just your spreadsheets." Richard blinked. The question hit him harder than he expected. Diane continued, her words steady now. "I've worked in these buildings for years, Mr. Hayes. I've cleaned rooms where people made million-dollar decisions. And the deals that actually close, the ones that work, they're never just about numbers. They're about connection. People invest in people, not presentations. You keep telling them what your company does, but you never told them why it matters. Not really. Not in a way that makes them feel something." The room went completely silent. Richard stared at her, his mind racing. She wasn't wrong. He had spent 3 weeks perfecting slides and polishing data points and rehearsing his pitch until it was flawless. But he had never once talked about himself. Not the real him. Not the man who had started with nothing. Not the version of Richard Hayes who used to sleep in his car because he couldn't afford rent. Not the guy who had worked 3 jobs just to keep his first business alive. Not the dreamer who had built this company because he wanted to prove that people like him, people who came from nothing, could create something that mattered. Somewhere along the way, he had buried that story. He had become polished, professional, corporate, and in doing so, he had become forgettable. Diane picked up her cart and moved toward the door. "I'm sorry if I overstepped, sir. I hope it works out for you." And then she was gone. Richard stood in the middle of that empty boardroom, staring at the space where she had been. His phone buzzed in his pocket, probably Michael or Karen checking in, but he didn't reach for it. Instead, he walked back to the window and looked out at the city below. And for the first time in weeks, he wasn't thinking about investor profiles or revenue projections or market analysis. He was thinking about a night 15 years ago when he was 26 years old, broke, exhausted, and absolutely terrified that he was going to fail. Richard Hayes didn't grow up with privilege. He didn't have a trust fund or family connections or a safety net to catch him if he fell. He grew up in a small town outside Columbus, Ohio, the youngest of 3 kids, raised by a father who worked at a steel mill and a mother who cleaned houses to make ends meet. Money was always tight. There were nights when dinner was whatever they could stretch into enough portions for 5 people. Richard learned early that if he wanted something, he had to work for it. No one was going to hand him anything, so he worked. He got his first job at 14, bagging groceries at the local supermarket. He saved every dollar he could. When he graduated high school, he didn't have the grades for a scholarship, and his family didn't have the money for a 4-year university, so he enrolled in community college and kept working. He worked at a gas station. He worked at a warehouse. He delivered pizzas on weekends. He studied business because it felt like the most practical path to something better, but he didn't love it. Not at first. What he loved was the idea that he could build something, that he could create opportunities for himself and maybe, one day, for other people too. By the time he was 23, he had his associate's degree and $15,000 saved up. It wasn't much, but it was enough to take a risk. He started a small logistics company, nothing fancy, just him, a used laptop, and a dream that felt way too big for the cramped studio apartment he shared with a roommate who worked night shifts at a factory. Richard pitched his idea to everyone: banks, small business lenders, anyone who might listen. Most of them laughed. Some didn't even return his calls. But one person saw something in him, an older man named Mr. Carver, who ran a regional shipping company. He didn't have much capital to invest, but he gave Richard his first contract, $5,000 to manage local deliveries for 3 months. It wasn't a fortune, but it was a start. Richard worked like a man possessed, 16-hour days, 18-hour days. There were nights he slept in the back of his car because it was easier than driving home just to turn around and leave again a few hours later. He lived on gas station, coffee, and vending machine snacks. He missed birthdays and holidays. He lost friends who didn't understand why he was killing himself for something that might not even work. But he kept going, because failure wasn't an option. Failure meant going back to barely scraping by. Failure meant proving everyone who doubted him right. And Richard Hayes refused to fail. Slowly, painfully, the company grew. 1 contract became 2, 2 became 5, 5 became 15. Within 3 years, he had a small team and a growing client list. Within 5 years, he sold that logistics company for $6 million. It wasn't billionaire money, but to a kid from Ohio who used to count pennies. It felt like winning the lottery. He could have retired. He could have taken the money and lived comfortably for the rest of his life. But Richard wasn't wired that way. He didn't build that first company just to cash out. He built it because he loved the process. He loved solving problems. He loved creating something from nothing. So he took that $6 million and started Hayes Global Solutions, a consulting firm that helped mid-sized companies scale and grow. And this time, he didn't just succeed, he exploded. Within 3 years, Hayes Global was managing contracts worth tens of millions. Within 5 years, Richard was a millionaire several times over. He hired the best talent. He moved into a corner office on the 42nd floor. He wore custom suits and attended galas and got invited to speak at conferences. People who used to ignore him now wanted meetings. Investors who used to hang up on him now returned his calls within the hour. He had made it, but somewhere in all of that success, something shifted. The man who used to answer every email personally now had 3 assistants managing his inbox. The man who used to meet clients in coffee shops now only took meetings in marble-floored boardrooms. The fire that had driven him in the beginning, the passion for helping people and building something meaningful, got buried under shareholder expectations and quarterly earnings reports and the pressure to keep growing, keep winning, keep proving he belonged in rooms with people who had never struggled the way he had. Richard became polished, smooth, corporate. He learned to speak the language of investors and executives. He learned to lead with data instead of emotion. He learned to be impressive. But in becoming impressive, he stopped being real. And tonight, a woman who cleaned offices for a living had seen straight through the armor he didn't even know he was wearing. Richard pulled out his phone and opened his contact list. He scrolled to Heinrich Müller, the lead investor. His thumb hovered over the call button. Then he stopped. Calling him now would look desperate. Worse, it would be more of the same. More polished corporate speak, more trying to impress instead of connect. Diane's words echoed in his mind. People invest in people, not presentations. Richard locked his phone and sat down at the conference table. He opened his laptop and pulled up the presentation he had been using for the past 3 weeks. Slide after slide of growth projections and market analysis and competitive advantages. It was all true, it was all accurate, but it was also completely soulless. He closed the laptop, then he opened a blank document and started writing. Not a pitch, not a proposal, just the truth. 40 minutes later, Michael knocked on the door and stepped inside. "Richard, we need to talk about next steps. Do we reach out to Muller tonight or give him space? Do we revise the offer?" Richard looked up from his laptop. "We're not revising anything." Michael frowned. "Then what's the plan?" Richard stood and closed his laptop. "The plan is, I'm going to tell them a story." Michael blinked. "A story?" Richard nodded. "The one I should have told them 3 weeks ago." Michael looked confused, but he knew better than to push when Richard had that look in his eyes. "All right. When?" "Tomorrow morning. Set up a breakfast meeting. Tell them it's informal. Just me and Heinrich. No slides, no presentations, just a conversation." Michael hesitated. "Richard, they're probably going to say no. They already told us they need time to think." "Then we give them a reason to stop thinking and start feeling," Richard said. Michael stared at him for a moment, then nodded slowly. "I'll make the call." He left, and Richard sat back down. His hands were shaking slightly, not from fear, from something else. Clarity, maybe, or hope. He didn't know if this would work. He didn't know if Heinrich would even agree to meet. But for the first time in weeks, Richard Hayes felt like himself again. Not the polished CEO, not the man in the expensive suit trying to impress people who had seen 1,000 pitches just like his. Just Richard. The kid from Ohio who used to believe that hard work and honesty could change everything. He glanced at the door where Diane had disappeared earlier. He didn't even know her last name. Didn't know anything about her except that she had said exactly what he needed to hear at exactly the right moment. He made a mental note to find her, to thank her, to ask her how someone who spent her nights cleaning offices had more insight into leadership than most of the executives he knew. But that could wait. Right now, he had a story to tell. The next morning, Richard sat in a quiet corner booth at a small restaurant 3 blocks from his office. It wasn't the kind of place he usually chose for business meetings. No chandeliers, no waiters in bow ties, just good coffee, warm lighting, and the kind of atmosphere that made people feel like talking. Heinrich Müller arrived exactly on time, which didn't surprise Richard. The man was nothing if not precise. He wore a charcoal grey suit and carried a leather briefcase that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. He spotted Richard and walked over, his expression neutral but curious. "Mr. Hayes," he said, extending his hand. Richard stood and shook it. "Mr. Müller, thank you for coming." Heinrich sat down across from him. "I'll admit, I was surprised by your invitation. Your assistant said this was informal." Richard nodded. "It is. No slides, no data, just a conversation." Heinrich raised an eyebrow. "A conversation about what?" Richard leaned back slightly and met his eyes. "About why I built this company and why I think you should trust me." Heinrich didn't respond right away. He studied Richard's face, looking for something. Then he nodded slowly. "All right, Mr. Hayes, I'm listening." Richard took a breath. 15 years ago, I was sleeping in the back of my car because I couldn't afford rent. I was 26 years old, working 3 jobs, trying to keep a business alive that most people told me would fail. I didn't come from money. I didn't have investors lining up to back me. I had $15,000 in savings, a used laptop, and a belief that if I worked hard enough, I could build something that mattered. Heinrich's expression didn't change, but Richard saw something shift in his eyes. Attention, maybe, or at least interest. Richard continued. "I started a logistics company, small contracts, local deliveries, nothing glamorous, but I worked 16-hour days. I missed holidays. I lost friends. I did everything I could to make it work. And eventually, it did. I sold that company for $6 million. It wasn't a fortune, but to someone like me, it felt like everything." Heinrich sipped his coffee but didn't interrupt. Richard leaned forward slightly. "I could have stopped there, taken the money and walked away. But I didn't build that company just to cash out. I built it because I wanted to prove something, that people like me, people who come from nothing, can create opportunities, not just for themselves, but for others. So I started Hayes Global Solutions. And yeah, we grew fast. We made a lot of money. We became successful. But somewhere along the way, I lost sight of why I started. I got so focused on being impressive that I forgot to be real." Richard paused, his voice quieter now. "When you and your team walked out of that boardroom yesterday, I was devastated. Not because I was losing a deal, but because I realized I had been treating you like every other investor treats their clients, like a transaction, like a number. And that's not who I am." Heinrich set down his coffee cup. "Then who are you, Mr. Hayes?" Richard smiled, and for the first time in weeks, it felt genuine. "I'm the guy who still remembers what it feels like to be underestimated. I'm the guy who built a company because I wanted to help businesses grow, not just profit off them. I'm the guy who believes that the best partnerships aren't built on spreadsheets, they're built on trust. And I know you don't know me well enough to trust me yet. But I'm asking you to give me the chance to earn it." The restaurant hummed quietly around them. Silverware clinked against plates. Conversations murmured in the background. But at their table, there was only silence. Heinrich leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled in front of his face. After a long moment, he spoke. "Do you know why we've been hesitant, Mr. Hayes?" Richard shook his head. Heinrich continued. "We've sat in dozens of boardrooms over the past 6 months. We've heard pitches from companies twice your size with twice your resources, and every single one of them sounded exactly the same. Polished, professional, impressive. But none of them felt human." Richard nodded slowly. Heinrich leaned forward. "What you just told me, that's what we've been waiting to hear. Not your projections, not your market analysis. We can get that anywhere. What we can't get is a leader who remembers where he came from. A leader who builds companies because he believes in something, not just because he wants to win." Richard felt his chest tighten, but in a good way. This time, the tension wasn't from fear, it was from hope. Heinrich reached into his briefcase and pulled out a leather portfolio. He set it on the table and slid it across to Richard. Inside was a contract, the same contract his team had been negotiating for 3 weeks. But at the bottom, in Heinrich's precise handwriting, was a signature and a date, today's date. Heinrich looked at Richard. "We're in, Mr. Hayes, $1 million, 18-month partnership, full terms as discussed." Richard stared at the contract, his hands trembling slightly as he picked it up. He read the signature line. Then he looked up at Heinrich, his voice barely above a whisper. "You're serious?" Heinrich smiled, and it was the first time Richard had seen the man show any real warmth. "I'm serious. You reminded me why I got into this business in the first place. Not to make money, to back people who are building something worth believing in." Richard set the contract down and extended his hand. Heinrich shook it firmly. "Welcome to the partnership, Mr. Hayes. I think we're going to do great things together." Richard couldn't speak. He just nodded, his throat tight with emotion. Heinrich stood, picked up his briefcase, and headed toward the door. But before he left, he turned back. "One more thing, Mr. Hayes. Whatever you do, don't lose that fire. The world has enough polished executives. It needs more people like you." And then he was gone. Richard sat alone in that booth, staring at the signed contract in front of him. $1 million, 18 months, a partnership that could change the trajectory of his entire company. And it had all come down to one conversation, one moment of honesty, one decision to stop trying to be impressive and start being real. He thought about Diane, the woman who had reminded him of something he had forgotten. He thought about her quiet voice in that boardroom. People invest in people, not presentations. She had been right. And because of her, everything had changed. When Richard walked back into his office an hour later, the energy was different. Michael was waiting for him near the elevator, his expression tense. "Well, did he show?" Richard didn't say anything. He just held up the signed contract. Michael's eyes went wide. "He signed?" Richard nodded, a grin spreading across his face. He signed. Michael let out a breath he didn't know he was holding. "Holy hell, Richard. What did you say to him?" Richard smiled. "I told him the truth." Michael shook his head, laughing in disbelief. "I don't know how you pulled that off, but I'm not going to question it." Richard clapped him on the shoulder. "Get the team together. We're celebrating tonight." Michael nodded and headed toward the conference room. Richard walked to his office and set the contract on his desk. Then he sat down and pulled out his phone. He opened his company directory and scrolled through the employee list until he found the facilities and cleaning staff section. There were dozens of names, but only one caught his eye. Diane Harper, night shift, building services. He stared at her name for a moment, then picked up his office phone and dialed the facilities manager. "This is Richard Hayes. I need you to do me a favor. I need to get in touch with one of your night staff, Diane Harper. Can you get me her contact information?" There was a pause on the other end. Mr. Hayes, is there a problem?" "No problem," Richard said. "I just need to speak with her. It's important." "All right, sir. I'll pull her file and send you her details." "Thank you." Richard hung up and leaned back in his chair. He didn't know what he was going to say to her yet, but he knew he owed her more than just a thank you. He owed her recognition. He owed her the chance to be seen, because Diane Harper wasn't just a cleaner. She was the person who had saved $1 million deal without even knowing it. And Richard Hayes didn't forget people like that. That evening, Richard sat in his office long after everyone else had gone home. The city lights flickered outside his window, and the building had settled into the kind of quiet that only came after business hours. He had the signed contract framed on his desk now, a reminder of what had happened that morning. A reminder that sometimes the biggest victories came from the smallest moments of truth. His phone buzzed. It was an email from the facilities manager with Diane Harper's employee file attached. Richard opened it and scanned the details. Diane Harper, age 38, employed with the building services company for 3 years and 7 months. Night shift, Monday through Friday, 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. No disciplinary issues, no complaints. Consistently rated as reliable and thorough by her supervisors. There was a phone number listed, but Richard hesitated. Calling her out of the blue felt intrusive. She didn't know him. Not really. To her, he was just another executive in a building full of them. He decided to wait. He would see her tonight when she came in for her shift. Richard had never stayed in the office past midnight before, but tonight was different. He told his assistant he'd be working late and to hold all calls. He ordered takeout from a place down the street and settled in at his desk, going through emails and reviewing the partnership agreement Heinrich had signed. The hours passed slowly. 9 o'clock became 10. 10 became 11. At 11:45, Richard heard the familiar sound of wheels rolling down the hallway outside his office. He stood up, straightened his tie out of habit, then realized how ridiculous that was. He loosened it instead and walked to the door. When he opened it, Diane was 3 doors down, emptying a trash bin into the large bag hanging from her cart. She looked up, surprised to see anyone still in the building at this hour. "Oh," she said, her voice soft. "I'm sorry, Mr. Hayes. I didn't know you were still here. I can come back later if you need privacy." "No," Richard said quickly. "Actually, I was hoping to talk to you." Diane's expression shifted to concern. "Did I do something wrong? I know I shouldn't have said anything yesterday. I really am sorry if I overstepped." Richard shook his head and stepped into the hallway. "You didn't do anything wrong, Diane. You did the exact opposite." She looked confused. Richard gestured toward his office. "Do you have a minute? I'd like to talk to you about something." Diane hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. "I'm on the clock, sir. I don't want to get in trouble for not finishing my rounds." "You won't," Richard said. "I'll make sure of it. Please, just 5 minutes." She glanced down the hallway, then back at him. After a moment, she nodded. "Okay." Richard held the door open, and Diane stepped into his office. She had never been inside before. She had cleaned the hallway outside it countless times, but the actual office was reserved for assistants and executives, not people like her. The space was large, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, a massive desk made of dark wood, leather chairs, bookshelves lined with business titles and framed awards. Diane stood near the door, her hands folded in front of her, clearly unsure of what to do. Richard gestured to one of the chairs in front of his desk. "Please sit." "I'd rather stand, if that's all right," Diane said quietly. "I don't want to get your chair dirty." Richard's chest tightened, not from pity, but from recognition. He had spent years around people who acted entitled to every comfort, every privilege. And here was a woman who had just changed the course of his entire company, worried about getting a chair dirty. "Diane," he said gently, "sit, please." She hesitated, then slowly lowered herself into the chair, perching on the edge like she might need to leave at any moment. Richard sat down across from her, leaning forward slightly. "I wanted to thank you," he said, "for what you said yesterday." Diane looked down at her hands. "I really shouldn't have said anything. It wasn't my place." "It absolutely was your place," Richard said firmly. "You saw something I couldn't see. You said something I needed to hear. And because of that, everything changed." Diane looked up, confused. "What do you mean?" Richard smiled. "That deal I was working on? The one that was falling apart? I closed it this morning." Her eyes widened slightly. "You did?" "I did," Richard said. $1 million, 18-month partnership, signed and sealed. Diane's face broke into a genuine smile. "That's wonderful, Mr. Hayes. I'm really happy for you." "I couldn't have done it without you," Richard said. She shook her head. "I didn't do anything. You're the one who closed the deal." "No," Richard said. "You're the one who reminded me how to close it. You told me that people invest in people, not presentations. And you were right. I went into that meeting this morning and I didn't bring slides or charts or data. I just told the truth. I told them my story. And it worked." "How?" Diane looked at him for a long moment, her expression softening. "I'm glad," she said quietly. "You deserved it." Richard leaned back in his chair. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course." "How did you know?" he asked. "How did you know that was what I needed to hear?" Diane thought about it for a moment, then spoke carefully. "I've been cleaning offices for a long time, Mr. Hayes. I've seen a lot of meetings, a lot of deals. And the ones that work, the ones that really stick, they're never just about business. They're about connection. People want to work with people they trust, people they believe in. And you can't build that kind of trust with a PowerPoint." Richard nodded slowly. "Where did you learn that?" Diane smiled, sadly. "Life, I guess. I didn't go to business school. I didn't even finish college. But I've spent a lot of time watching people, listening to them. And you learn things when you're invisible. Number 3. You're not invisible, Richard said. Diane looked at him, something unreadable in her eyes. To most people in this building, I am. Richard felt the weight of that statement settle over him. She wasn't wrong. How many times had he walked past cleaning staff without even acknowledging them? How many times had he been so focused on his own world that he didn't see the people who kept that world running? I'm sorry, he said quietly. Diane shook her head. You don't need to apologize, Mr. Hayes. That's just how it is. It shouldn't be, Richard said. They sat in silence for a moment. Then Richard stood up and walked over to his desk. He opened a drawer and pulled out an envelope. He had prepared it earlier that evening, not entirely sure if he'd have the courage to follow through. But sitting here now, talking to Diane, he knew it was the right thing to do. He walked back over and handed her the envelope. Diane looked at it, confused. What's this? Open it, Richard said. She hesitated, then carefully opened the envelope. Inside was a check. Her hands trembled slightly as she pulled it out and read the amount. $5,000. Her eyes shot up to Richard's. I can't accept this. Yes, you can, Richard said. Mr. Hayes, I didn't do anything to earn this. You saved $1 million deal, Richard said. If that's not worth $5,000, I don't know what is. Diane shook her head, her voice thick with emotion. I was just doing my job. I was just cleaning the room. You did more than that, Richard said, and I want you to have it. No strings attached. Use it however you need to. 2. Diane stared at the check, tears welling in her eyes. I have 2 kids, she said quietly. I've been trying to save up for months just to get them new school supplies. This is more than I make in 2 months. Richard's throat tightened. Then take it, please. Diane looked up at him, and for a moment, she looked like she might argue. But then she nodded, her voice barely a whisper. Thank you. Richard smiled. You're welcome. Diane carefully folded the check and put it back in the envelope. She stood up, wiping her eyes quickly. I should get back to work. Diane, Richard said. She turned. If you ever need anything, he said, and I mean anything, you come find me, okay? She nodded, her smile genuine now. Okay. And then she left, quietly closing the door behind her. Richard stood in the middle of his office, staring at the door. He felt lighter somehow, like something that had been weighing on him for years had finally been lifted. He didn't know it yet, but that moment, that conversation, would change both of their lives in ways neither of them could have imagined. 3 days later, Richard was in a meeting with his senior leadership team when his assistant knocked on the door. I'm sorry to interrupt, she said, but there's someone here to see you. She says it's important. Richard frowned. I don't have anything scheduled. I don't have anything scheduled. I know, his assistant said, but she's insisting. Her name is Diane Harper. Richard's expression shifted immediately. Send her in. His team looked confused, but Richard didn't offer an explanation. A moment later, Diane stepped into the conference room, looking nervous and out of place in her street clothes instead of her uniform. I'm so sorry, she said quickly. I know you're in a meeting, but I needed to talk to you, and I didn't know how else to reach you. Richard stood up. It's fine. Give us a minute. His team filed out, shooting curious glances at Diane as they left. Once the door was closed, Richard gestured to a chair. What's going on? Is everything okay? Diane nodded quickly. Everything's fine. Better than fine, actually. I wanted to tell you something. Richard sat down across from her. I'm listening. I'm listening. Diane took a breath. I used that money you gave me, the $5,000. Richard nodded. Good. I'm glad. I used it to enroll in a business course, Diane said. Online. It's through a community college. I've always wanted to go back to school, but I could never afford it. And now I can, because of you. Richard felt a swell of emotion rise in his chest. Diane, that's incredible. She smiled, and it lit up her entire face. I start next week. I'm terrified. I haven't been in a classroom in almost 20 years, but I'm excited too. You're going to be great, Richard said. Diane looked down at her hands. I also wanted to ask you something, And you can absolutely say no. I won't be offended. What is it? She looked up, her expression hopeful but cautious. Would you be willing to write me a letter of recommendation? For the program. They don't require one, but it would help. And I know we don't really know each other, but I thought maybe. How people? Yes, Richard said before she could finish. Diane blinked. Really? Absolutely, Richard said. I'll write you the best letter of recommendation you've ever seen. Diane's eyes filled with tears again. Thank you. Thank you so much. Richard stood up and walked around the table. You don't need to thank me, Diane. You're doing this. You're the one taking the risk. I'm just supporting you. She wiped her eyes and stood as well. I should let you get back to your meeting. Wait, Richard said. She paused. Richard thought for a moment, then made a decision. What if I told you I had a better idea? Diane looked confused. What do you mean? Oh, what if instead of just writing you a letter, Richard said slowly, I offered you a job? Diane's eyes went wide. A job? Here, Richard confirmed. Not cleaning. A real position. Entry level, sure, but with room to grow. You'd work with our operations team. Learn the business from the inside. Get real experience while you're taking your classes. Diane stared at him like he had just spoken a different language. Mr. Hayes, I don't have a degree. I don't have any experience in corporate work. You have something better, Richard said. You have perspective, you have insight, and you're willing to learn. That's worth more than any degree. Diane shook her head slowly, overwhelmed. I don't know what to say. Say yes, Richard said. She looked at him for a long moment. Then, slowly, a smile spread across her face. Yes. Richard grinned. Good. I'll have HR draw up the paperwork. You'll start Monday. Diane laughed, a sound full of disbelief and joy. This doesn't feel real. It's real, Richard said, and you earned it. Diane wiped her eyes one more time, then extended her hand. Thank you, Mr. Hayes. I won't let you down. Richard shook her hand firmly. I know you won't. As Diane left the conference room, Richard's leadership team slowly filed back in, all of them staring at him with confusion. Who was that? Michael asked. Richard sat back down at the head of the table, a satisfied smile on his face. That, he said, was the woman who just saved this company, and starting Monday, she's part of the team. Michael raised an eyebrow. You hired the cleaning lady? I hired someone with more business sense than half the people in this building, Richard said. And I'd do it again in a heartbeat. The room went quiet. Then Michael smiled. All right then. Welcome to the team, Diane Harper. The following Monday, Diane walked into Hayes Global Solutions for the first time as an employee, not as a cleaner. She wore a simple blouse and slacks, clothes she had bought over the weekend with part of the money Richard had given her. Her hands trembled slightly as she approached the reception desk. The receptionist smiled warmly. Good morning. Can I help you? I'm Diane Harper, she said. I'm starting today, in operations. The receptionist checked her computer, then nodded. Yes, we've been expecting you. Let me call someone to bring you up. A few minutes later, Karen, the head of operations, came down to meet her. She was a tall woman in her 50s with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. Diane, she said, extending her hand. Welcome. Richard told me all about you. Diane shook her hand. Thank you for having me. I know this is unusual. Karen smiled. Unusual is good. Come on. I'll show you to your desk. As they walked through the office, Diane noticed people glancing at her, some with curiosity, some with confusion, a few with something that looked like judgment. She kept her head up and followed Karen to a small desk near the operations department. This is you, Karen said. It's not much, but it's a start. Diane looked at the desk. It had a computer, a phone, a small lamp, and a nameplate that read Diane Harper, Operations Assistant. Her throat tightened. It's perfect, she said quietly. Karen smiled. Good. Let's get you set up. The first few weeks were hard. Diane had to learn systems she had never used before, software she had never seen, processes that felt completely foreign, but she worked harder than anyone else in the department. She stayed late. She asked questions. She took notes. And slowly, people started to notice. One afternoon, about a month into her new role, Diane was working on a logistics report when she noticed something off. A shipment schedule that didn't match the delivery windows. It was a small error, but if it went through, it would cost the company thousands of dollars in delays. She flagged it and brought it to Karen's attention. Karen reviewed it, her eyes widening. "Good catch, Diane. This would have been a disaster." Diane smiled, relieved. "I just noticed the numbers didn't line up." Karen looked at her with newfound respect. "You've got a good eye. Keep it up." Word got around. Within 2 months, Diane wasn't just the new hire anymore. She was the person people went to when they needed a second set of eyes on a project. She was the person who asked the questions no one else thought to ask. She was the person who reminded everyone that sometimes the best solutions came from seeing things differently. And Richard watched it all with quiet pride. One evening, about 3 months after Diane had started, Richard called her into his office. She walked in, slightly nervous, wondering if she had done something wrong. "Sit," Richard said, gesturing to the chair. She sat. Richard leaned back in his chair, a small smile on his face. "I wanted to check in. How are you doing?" Diane relaxed slightly. "Good. Really good, actually. I'm learning a lot." "I've heard," Richard said. "Karen tells me you've been killing it." Diane blushed. "I'm just trying to keep up." "You're doing more than that," Richard said. "You're exceeding expectations, and I wanted you to know that I see it." Diane smiled. "Thank you, Mr. Hayes. That means a lot." Richard leaned forward. "I also wanted to talk to you about something else." "Okay." "I'm putting together a new initiative," Richard said. "A mentorship program for employees who want to move up in the company but don't have traditional backgrounds. People who are smart, hard-working and hungry, but maybe didn't go to a 4-year university or don't have the typical resume." Diane listened intently. "I want you to help me build it," Richard said. Her eyes widened. "Me?" You," Richard confirmed. "You know what it's like to be underestimated. You know what it takes to prove yourself, and I think you'd be perfect for this." Diane was speechless. Richard smiled. "Think about it. You don't have to answer right now, but I wanted you to know I'm serious." Diane nodded slowly, her mind racing. "I'll think about it." "Good," Richard said. "Now get out of here. Go home. Spend time with your kids." Diane stood up, still processing everything. "Thank you, Mr. Hayes." "Richard," he said. "Call me Richard." She smiled. "Thank you, Richard." As Diane left his office, Richard leaned back in his chair and looked out at the city. He thought about the night he had stood in that boardroom, defeated and lost. He thought about the woman who had walked in with a cleaning cart and changed everything. And he thought about how sometimes the most important moments in life came from the people you least expected. People like Diane Harper, who reminded him that real leadership wasn't about being the smartest person in the room. It was about being wise enough to listen, humble enough to learn, and brave enough to recognize brilliance, no matter where it came from. 6 months had passed since Diane Harper walked into Hayes Global Solutions as an employee instead of a cleaner. 6 months that had transformed not just her life, but the entire culture of the company. The mentorship program Richard had proposed was now in full swing. They called it the Elevation Initiative, and it was designed specifically for people who had the talent and drive, but lacked the traditional credentials that corporate America usually demanded. Diane had helped design the entire program from the ground up. She interviewed candidates. She created training modules. She shared her own story with new hires who felt out of place in boardrooms and conference calls. And it was working. Within the first 3 months, the Elevation Initiative had brought in 12 new employees. A former delivery driver who was now excelling in logistics. A single mother who had been working retail for 15 years and now managed client relations. A veteran who struggled to find work after leaving the military and was now one of their top project coordinators. People who had been overlooked their entire lives were finally being seen, and the company was better for it. Richard stood in the conference room one Thursday afternoon, looking at the latest quarterly report. Revenue was up 18%. Client satisfaction scores had hit an all-time high. Employee retention had improved significantly. Michael walked in, carrying his own copy of the report. "Have you seen these numbers?" Michael asked, grinning. Richard nodded. "I have." "This is the best quarter we've had in 3 years," Michael said. Whatever we're doing, we need to keep doing it. Richard smiled. It's not what we're doing, it's who we're becoming. Michael tilted his head. What do you mean? Richard set down the report and looked at him. A year ago, this company was all about performance metrics and profit margins. We hired people who looked good on paper. We chased deals that made us look impressive, but we forgot the most important thing, which is people, Richard said simply. We forgot that businesses are built by people, with real stories. And when you start valuing people for who they are, not just what they can produce, everything changes. Michael nodded slowly. You're talking about Diane. I'm talking about everyone, Richard said. Diane was the wake-up call, but she's not the only one. Look at the people we've brought in through the Elevation Initiative. Every single one of them has brought something unique to this company, something we never would have found if we kept hiring the same types of people over and over. Michael leaned against the table. You know, when you first told me you were hiring her, I thought you were making a mistake. Richard raised an eyebrow. And now? Michael smiled. Now I think it's the best decision you've ever made. Richard laughed. I'll take that as a compliment. You should, Michael said, because it is. That evening, Richard was finishing up some emails when there was a knock on his office door. Come in, he called. Diane stepped inside, holding a folder. She had changed a lot in the past 6 months. She carried herself differently now, more confident, more comfortable in her own skin. But she still had that same warmth in her eyes, that same humility that made people trust her. Do you have a minute? She asked. Always, Richard said, gesturing to the chair across from him. Diane sat down and placed the folder on the desk. I wanted to show you something. Richard opened the folder. Inside were several documents, completion certificates from her online business courses, a letter of acceptance from a local university's degree completion program, and a proposal for expanding the Elevation Initiative into other cities. Richard looked up at her, impressed. Diane, this is incredible. She smiled. I've been working on it for a few weeks. I think if we can make this work here, we can make it work anywhere. There are people in every city who just need a chance, and if we can give it to them, we should. Richard leaned back in his chair, studying the proposal. This would require a significant investment. New staff, new resources, new infrastructure. I know, Diane said, but I think it's worth it. Richard looked at her for a long moment, then he smiled. So do I. Diane's eyes widened. Really? Really, Richard said. Let's do it, but on one condition. What's that? You lead it, Richard said. Diane blinked. Me? You, Richard confirmed. You built this program from nothing. You understand it better than anyone, and people trust you. If we're going to expand this, I need someone at the helm who believes in it as much as I do. Diane stared at him, speechless. I know it's a lot, Richard said gently, and I know it's a big step, but I wouldn't offer it if I didn't think you could handle it. Diane took a shaky breath. I don't know what to say. Say yes, Richard said, echoing the same words he had spoken to her 6 months ago. Diane laughed, tears springing to her eyes. Yes, I'll do it. Richard stood up and extended his hand. Welcome to the leadership team, Diane. She stood as well and shook his hand, her grip firm despite the emotion in her eyes. Thank you, Richard, for everything. You've earned this, Richard said. Every bit of it. As Diane left his office, Richard sat back down and looked out at the city. He thought about how much had changed in the past year, how a single moment of honesty had saved $1 million deal, how a single conversation with a woman no one noticed had changed the trajectory of his entire company. And he realized something. Success wasn't just about making money or closing deals or building empires. Success was about the people you lifted along the way, the lives you changed, the opportunities you created. And if he could do that, if he could build a company that gave people like Diane a chance to rise, then he had truly succeeded. 3 months later, Hayes Global Solutions held its annual company-wide meeting. It was the biggest one they had ever had. Over 200 employees packed into the main conference hall, along with several investors and board members. Richard stood at the front of the room, looking out at the sea of faces. Some he recognized, some were new, but all of them were part of something bigger now. "Thank you all for being here," Richard began. "I know these meetings can be long, so I'll keep this as brief as possible." A few people chuckled. Richard smiled. "A year ago, this company was at a crossroads. We were successful on paper, but something was missing. We had lost sight of why we started. We had become so focused on being impressive that we forgot to be real." The room was silent, everyone listening intently. "And then, something happened," Richard continued. "Something that changed everything. I met someone who reminded me that the best ideas don't always come from the people with the fanciest degrees or the most experience. Sometimes they come from the people who see things differently, who ask the questions no one else thinks to ask, who have the courage to speak up, even when they think no one is listening." Richard looked directly at Diane, who was sitting in the front row. Diane Harper was working as a cleaner in this building when she said something to me that saved $1 million deal. But more than that, she reminded me what real leadership looks like. She reminded me that people matter more than presentations. That trust is built through honesty, not polish, and that the most valuable voices in a company are often the ones we're not listening to. Diane's eyes filled with tears, but she kept her composure. Richard continued, "Because of Diane, we created the Elevation Initiative, a program designed to give talented, hard-working people a chance to build careers here, regardless of their background. And I'm proud to say that in the past 6 months, this program has brought in some of the best employees we've ever had." The room erupted in applause. Richard waited for it to die down before continuing. "But we're not stopping there. I'm thrilled to announce that we're expanding the Elevation Initiative to 5 new cities over the next year. And leading that expansion is the woman who built this program from the ground up, our new Director of Talent Development, Diane Harper." The applause was thunderous this time. People stood up. Diane covered her face with her hands, overwhelmed. Richard gestured for her to come up to the front. She hesitated, then slowly made her way to the stage. When she stood beside Richard, he handed her the microphone. Diane looked out at the room, her voice trembling slightly. "I don't even know where to start," she said. "A year ago, I was cleaning these offices at night. I had 2 kids at home, bills I could barely pay, and dreams that felt impossible. I never thought someone like me would end up here." She paused, collecting herself. "But Richard saw something in me that I didn't even see in myself. He gave me a chance when no one else would, and because of that, my entire life has changed. My kids have a better future. I have a career I love, and I get to help other people find the same opportunities I found." Her voice grew stronger now. "So to everyone in this room who feels like they don't belong, who thinks they're not good enough, who believes their background disqualifies them from success, I want you to know something. You belong here. You are good enough. And your story matters. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." The room erupted again. People were on their feet, clapping and cheering. Diane handed the microphone back to Richard, tears streaming down her face. Richard put his arm around her shoulder briefly, then spoke into the microphone one last time. "This is what Hays Global Solutions is about now. Not just profit, not just growth, but people, real people with real dreams. And we're going to keep building a company that honors that. Thank you all for being part of this journey." AIFT9. As the meeting ended and people began to file out, dozens of employees came up to Diane to congratulate her. Some shook her hand. Some hugged her. One woman, a new hire from the Elevation Initiative, whispered, "You changed my life. Thank you." Diane hugged her tightly, unable to speak. Later that evening, after everyone had gone home, Richard and Diane stood together in the now empty conference hall. "How are you feeling?" Richard asked. Diane laughed, wiping her eyes. "Overwhelmed, grateful, terrified. All of it." Richard smiled. "That sounds about right." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment. Then Diane spoke quietly. "You know, I almost didn't say anything that night." Richard looked at her. "What do you mean?" "That night in the boardroom," Diane said, "when I saw you standing there looking so defeated, I almost just cleaned the room and left. I told myself it wasn't my place to say anything, that you wouldn't listen to someone like me anyway." "What made you speak up?" Richard asked. Diane thought about it. "I don't know. Maybe I saw something in you that reminded me of myself. Someone who was trying so hard to be what everyone else expected that they forgot who they really were. And I thought, if I don't say something, who will? Richard nodded slowly. I'm glad you did. Me too, Diane said. They walked toward the exit together. As they reached the door, Diane turned to Richard. Can I ask you something? Anything. Why did you really hire me? She asked. I know what you've said publicly, but I want to know the real reason. Richard stopped and looked at her directly. Because you reminded me why I started this company in the first place. And I realized that if I surrounded myself with people who thought like you, people who saw the world differently, people who weren't afraid to challenge the status quo, then we could build something truly special. Not just a successful company, but a meaningful one. Diane smiled. That's a good reason. It's the only reason that matters, Richard said. They walked out into the cool night air. The city stretched out before them, lights twinkling like stars. Diane looked up at the building they had just left. You know what's funny? She said. What? I used to come to this building every night and dream about what it would be like to work inside, to have a desk, to be part of something bigger. And now I am. It still doesn't feel real sometimes. It's real, Richard said. And you belong here just as much as anyone else. Diane looked at him. Thank you, Richard, for seeing me when no one else did. Richard shook his head. I think you had it backwards. You're the one who saw me, really saw me, and you had the courage to tell me the truth. That's rare, and it's valuable. Don't ever lose that. Diane nodded, her eyes bright with emotion. They said their goodbyes, and Diane headed toward the parking garage where her car was waiting. As Richard watched her go, he felt a profound sense of gratitude, not just for the $1 million deal that had been saved, not just for the success of the Elevation Initiative, but for the reminder that the most important moments in life often came from the most unexpected places. From a woman with a cleaning cart and a kind heart who had the wisdom to speak up when it mattered most. And as Richard walked to his own car, he made a promise to himself. He would never forget that lesson. He would never stop listening. And he would never stop looking for the Dianes of the world. The people who were underestimated, overlooked, and undervalued. Because those were the people who had the power to change everything. 2 years later, Hays Global Solutions was named one of the top companies to work for in the country. The Elevation Initiative had expanded to 12 cities and had helped over 300 people build careers they never thought possible. Diane Harper had been promoted twice. She was now Vice President of Talent and Culture, overseeing not just the Elevation Initiative, but the entire company's approach to hiring, training, and employee development. She had finished her bachelor's degree. Her kids were thriving. Her son had just been accepted into college. Her daughter was excelling in high school. And Diane herself had become a sought-after speaker, traveling to conferences and companies around the country to share her story and inspire others. But no matter how busy she got, no matter how far she climbed, she never forgot where she came from. She still remembered what it felt like to push a cleaning cart through empty hallways at 2 in the morning. She still remembered what it felt like to be invisible. And she made it her mission to ensure that no one at Hays Global Solutions ever felt that way again. One afternoon, Diane was in her office when her assistant knocked on the door. There's someone here to see you, her assistant said. She doesn't have an appointment, but she says it's important. Diane looked up from her computer. Who is it? Her name is Monica. She works in the custodial staff for the building. Diane's heart skipped a beat. Send her in. A moment later, a young woman in her mid-20s stepped into the office. She wore the same navy blue uniform Diane used to wear. Her eyes were nervous but determined. I'm so sorry to bother you, Miss Harper, Monica said quickly. I know you're busy, but I heard about the Elevation Initiative, and I wanted to ask if there was any way I could apply. Diane stood up and walked around her desk. You're not bothering me at all. Please, sit. Monica sat down, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Diane sat across from her. Tell me about yourself. Monica took a breath. I've been working as a cleaner for 3 years. I'm taking online classes when I can, but it's hard. I have a daughter. She's 4, and I'm trying to give her a better life than I had. I don't have a degree yet. I don't have experience in corporate work, but I'm smart, and I work hard. And I just need someone to give me a chance. Diane felt tears prick her eyes. She saw herself in this young woman. The same hope, the same fear, the same desperate need to be seen. Monica, Diane said gently, I'm going to do more than give you a chance. I'm going to make sure you succeed. Monica's eyes widened. Really? Really, Diane said. Fill out an application for the Elevation Initiative. List me as a reference, and I'll personally make sure it gets to the right people. Monica's hands flew to her mouth, tears spilling down her cheeks. Thank you. Thank you so much. Diane reached across and took her hand. You're going to do great things, Monica. I can already see it. As Monica left her office, Diane sat back down and looked out the window. She thought about the night she had walked into that boardroom and said the words that changed everything. She thought about Richard, who had the humility to listen and the courage to act. She thought about all the people whose lives had been transformed because one man decided to value people over presentations. And she thought about the ripple effect that single moment had created. Because that's what happened when you saw people, really saw them. When you listened to voices that were usually ignored, when you gave chances to people who had been overlooked their entire lives. You didn't just change one life, you changed hundreds, thousands. You changed the world. And it all started with one sentence, one moment of truth. One woman who had the courage to speak up, and one man who had the wisdom to listen. Richard Hayes stood on a stage in front of 500 people at a national business conference. He had been invited to speak about leadership and innovation, but as he looked out at the audience, he knew exactly what story he needed to tell. 5 years ago, Richard began, I was standing in my boardroom, watching $1 million deal fall apart. I had done everything right, perfect presentation, solid numbers, flawless pitch, but it wasn't working, and I didn't know why. The audience leaned forward, listening. That night, Richard continued, a woman came into my office. She worked as a cleaner in my building. Most people didn't even know her name, but she saw something I couldn't see, and she had the courage to tell me the truth. Richard paused, letting the weight of the moment settle. She told me that people don't invest in companies, they invest in people, and that I had spent so much time trying to be impressive that I had forgotten to be real. He smiled. That one sentence changed everything. It saved the deal, but more than that, it changed how I lead. It changed how I hire. It changed what I value in this company. Because I realized that the best ideas don't come from the people with the most credentials. They come from the people who see things differently, who aren't afraid to challenge assumptions, who have lived experiences that give them perspectives the rest of us don't have. The room was completely silent. That woman's name is Diane Harper, Richard said, and today, she's the Vice President of Talent and Culture at my company. She's built a program that has transformed hundreds of lives. She's become a leader, a mentor, and one of the most valuable people in my organization. And it all started because I was willing to listen to someone the world had taught me to ignore. Richard's voice grew stronger. So here's my challenge to all of you. Look around your companies. Look at the people you're not seeing, the voices you're not hearing, the talent you're overlooking because it doesn't fit the traditional mold. And ask yourself, what am I missing? Who am I missing? Because I promise you, the next great idea in your company might not come from your executive team. It might come from someone you've never noticed before. And if you're not listening, you'll never know. The audience erupted in applause. As Richard walked off the stage, he saw Diane standing in the wings, smiling. That was beautiful, she said. Richard hugged her. It was true. Diane pulled back, her eyes shining. You know what the best part is? What? This story doesn't end with us, Diane said. Every person we've helped through the Elevation Initiative, every life we've changed, they're going to go out and do the same thing for someone else. They're going to see people who are invisible. They're going to give chances to people who need them, and the ripple effect is going to keep going long after we're gone. Richard nodded. That's the legacy I want to leave. Then you're doing it, Diane said. Every single day. They stood together in comfortable silence. Two people whose lives had intersected in the most unexpected way and had created something beautiful because of it. And as they walked out of the conference hall together, Richard thought about the question Heinrich Müller had asked him all those years ago. What makes you different? He finally had the answer. He was different because he had learned to listen. He was different because he valued people over profit. He was different because he believed that everyone deserved a chance to rise. And he was different because a woman named Diane Harper had the courage to speak truth to power when it mattered most. That was what made him different. That was what made this company different. And that was what would keep making a difference for years to come. Because at the end of the day, business wasn't about deals or contracts or revenue. It was about people with real dreams. And when you honored that, when you truly saw people and gave them the opportunities they deserved, you didn't just build a successful company, you built a legacy. Have you ever received advice from someone unexpected that changed your life? Someone the world told you not to listen to, but who saw something you couldn't see? Drop your story in the comments below. I'd love to hear it. And if this story touched your heart, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and share this with someone who needs to hear it today. Because you never know whose life might change because of one moment of courage, one sentence, one truth. Thank you for watching. And remember, the most valuable voices are often the ones we're not listening to. Don't let them go unheard.